start, I did some research to find what types of boxes I liked and what I wanted to do with my box. After finding what I wanted my box to look like, I had to draw a plan for my box with all the measurements. Then I went into the shed and found some wood that I wanted to use. Black wood for the outside, red gum for the top, and jarrah for the corners. Step 1. I took the black wood that I chose to be the sides and ran it through the thicknesser. This takes off the top layers to make it flat and to take the bark off. I then flipped it over to do the same on the other side. This also reveals what the wood will actually look like before the grain. Now that I have my sides milled down, I then have to cut them to the thickness that I want. The table saw won't go high enough, so I have to do it in 2 cuts, one on each side, straight down the middle. This now gives me roughly the thickness I want for the sides. I took my 2 long pieces of wood to the chop saw. I marked where they were with blemishes, such as knots, marks, and grain pulling up. I cut them out, making sure that it would give me enough wood for the sides. Now that I have 4 pieces of wood, I then have to choose on each piece which side I want to be the top and bottom, and which face I want to be on the outside and inside. I then lower the table saw blade to the right height I want for the groove. This cut then gives us a slot all around the inside for the bottom to slot into. This is so it can hold some weight. Step 5. For me, I have the accessibility to tools and skills to make my own slice of wood for the top, if not skip this step. For my top, I chose red gum. The only piece we had big enough was a block of red gum. I then had to cut a thin sliver out of the block. This is super dangerous, so my dad did it for me. We now need to sand it because we can't after it's inside the box. The red gum I just cut isn't to size yet. This is good for sanding because if you accidentally round the corners off, it doesn't matter because you're cutting it off anyway. So I went through the grits, 60, 80, 120, 180, so it's nice and smooth and flat. After a quick sand on top and a good sand on the bottom, I now need to cut the red gum to size. I marked the height and length of the red gum. I then went to cut it to size using the chop saw. Make sure you're super precise because this needs to be perfect so there's no gap when you put it in the top. For my bottom, I have some pretty thin MDF board that will fit. If you don't have this, you can use a regular piece of timber. I have to figure out how much to add for the groove. Marked it and then cut it on the table saw. Be careful, it can easily flick up and because it is thin and light. When gluing, it's always better to have a helper. Before we glue, we always do a dry fit and a dry run. The dry fit is where we see if everything fits together properly with no gaps, and the dry run is where we do what we would do with glue, just without glue. After those have been completed and everything fits together perfectly, then you can do the actual glue on. After covering all the faces that need glue with glue, making sure that I had just enough glue and not too much, I then put everything together very carefully and put the clamps on. If you have too much glue and some swishes out, very carefully wipe it with a damp cloth, making sure not to spread the glue. After leaving the box for a couple of days, I carefully removed the clamps, making sure not to scratch anything. After assessing the box, I really wasn't happy as the top clamps we put on pulled the box out of shape. So I had to hand sand the corners that were sticking out, making sure not to round the corners off. After I was happy with the corners and that they were flat and flush, I machine sanded all 4 sides and the top. Then using a sandpaper sheet, I sanded the bottom with even pressure, keeping it flat. This is optional. I started by figuring out whether I wanted 1, 2 or 3 splines. After deciding on one, I marked the center. My dad had already made a spline jig for doing these corners on the table saw. I then moved the table saw guide to the correct length. I then made a cut on all 4 corners very carefully. I then found some thin jarrah triangles and cut them into thin strips. After I made sure everything fit, I then glued it up. This time I didn't need clamps. After the glue dried, I used a super thin Japanese saw. If you don't have one, you can use a normal saw. It'll just need more sanding. Before I cut the excess off, I taped up all the sides so that the saw wouldn't damage the box. When I cut it off, I made sure to keep the blade as close to possible as the box, so there was less sanding. I then hand sanded the corners down using 180 until I thought it was close enough to use the machine sander, also at 180. I now need to cut the top off. I set the saw height to a fourth of the height of the box, when turned onto its long side. This is so that there's less to cut through in the second cut. I cut the first long side, then flipped it over to do it to the other. Now I need to cut the small size. Part is already cut, so I lowered the sword to about half the width of the wood, so it doesn't cut all the way through. Otherwise, if it did, when the lid cuts through, it could go into the blade, damaging the lid and making a gouge. Now that the top is cut off with the table saw, I need to use the extremely thin Japanese saw to cut through the rest. This is where I made a mistake. Make sure you don't cut into the box, which is what I did a little of. Now that we've cut the top off, there is still a lot of material. Now we have to sand it all down. This will take a while. After the rest of the unwanted material has been sanded out, we now use the large sandpaper taped to the bench to sand the top to ensure that it's flat. Now that the top of the box has been sanded to around the final amount, we now need to add some weight to attach the lid. My first thought was a hinge, but we didn't have the right type, and it was going to be pretty difficult. So I went with a pull-off style lid. So I measured out the inside legs and found some fairly thin long strips that would be perfect. I cut them to length and tested to see if they would fit. Unsurprisingly, they didn't. So I sanded them in extremely small amounts until it just squeezed in. I then put a small amount of glue into it, squeezed the pieces into place and clamped them down. Now this is the most important step. We now have our box, but to make it look nice, we need to sand everything. We also need to make sure that there is no scratches anywhere or marks. Otherwise, when we wax it, it will show up and stand out. Also, if there is any glue anywhere, the wax will not stick to it, so you need to remove any excess glue. This is the last step. Get a microfiber cloth and make sure that there's nothing that can scratch in it, and lay some newspaper down. Get the microfiber towel and put a small amount of liquid wax on it. Now you need to evenly spread it all over the box, every crevice, small crack, everything. Let it soak in for a couple of minutes, then wipe it off with a second microfiber towel, making sure that it's even. In conclusion, now that my box is finished, there's a couple of things I would have done differently. Firstly, when I did the glue up on my box, when I put the clamp on the long edges, it pulled the entire box out of shape. So not only did the corners stick out a bit and it was visible in the final piece, but it meant that because it was out of shape, the top isn't reversible. I could have prevented this by not putting the top clamps on, which we needed, so that is not good. So secondly, we could have got another clamp that went all the way around, and we could put that at the top, but we didn't have that. So our most likely option was we could have put clamps on the short sides to counteract the force of the other clamps. If I did this, it would have probably had an almost perfect box. The second thing that I could have prevented is there's a gap all along the rim of the box. This is because when I've sanded it, I didn't do it evenly, so it's partially rounded off the edges. I could have prevented this by using sandpaper taped to the bench to ensure that it was flat. Although there were some things I would change if I did it again, there are some things I liked that I changed, like the pull-off lid. I like the pull-off style lid rather than the hinge design that I originally had. I wouldn't have had this pull-off style if I had the correct hinges, or I improved my design. Instead of having multiple woods in the lid, I actually preferred the single piece of red gum, which improved and refined the look of the box and made it look more luxurious. So overall, now I have a fully functioning box and I love it.